the question that always bothered me philosophically is that, the world of physics seems to be deeply mathematical, right? The Schrödinger equation, Einstein's field equations, it's deeply mathematical, mostly partial differential equations nowadays, I guess, anyway. But biology is not that way, right? Biology is a million-pound marshmallow. And obviously, we're very interested in biology. We're biological organisms, right? And we're very interested in understanding biology better, maybe so we can cure diseases or prevent diseases, which would be even better. There is this thing that always bothered me, that pure math doesn't seem to enlighten us about biology as much as it enlightens us about the physical world. And there are some mathematical theories in biology, of course. There's what used to be called, what is it called?
Biophysics? Game theory?
No, well, yes, but evolution seems to be the most important idea in biology. The most central idea is Darwin's theory of evolution, right? The question is, how do you explain the creation of life is important, but also how do you explain the diversity of life forms across this planet? And the explanation for that is supposed to be Darwin's theory of evolution, or the modern versions of it, right? Which combine Mendelian genetics and something called, I think it's called population genetics, which the modern synthesis is based on three legs, right? One is Darwin's original theory, which people rejected initially.
Yes.
But then when you combined it with Mendelian genetics, and then you combine it with some nice, elegant mathematics called population genetics, looking at how gene frequencies change in a population in response to selective pressures.
Uh-huh.
This was sort of the three legs of, I think, was called the modern synthesis. Now, modern synthesis, I don't know how modern it was. Maybe it was the 1930s. But this was the rebirth of Darwin's theory, which people thought was sort of ridiculous at first. They didn't like the idea that everything comes from randomness. It had been God that had created organisms. And then all of a sudden, God is replaced by randomness. And I think the initial reaction was largely negative. I don't know. I used to like reading plays by George Bernard Shaw, and he would comment about the reception because he lived through Darwin's theory and the initial reactions to it. And he has a play called Back to Methuselah, which is almost unstageable because it has 5 acts occurring. It's like science fiction over thousands of years. And it's talking about the evolution of the human race, going back from the Garden of Eden to human beings that are godlike. And I don't know if this would be 5 hours or more to perform. It's been done very rarely. But I think it's based on his reading of Darwin's theory of evolution, right? Which he talks about in an enormous prologue. His plays were often accompanied by prologues or epilogues that were as long as the play, which were very didactic, and where Shaw was expressing his opinion on everything. Well, anyway, I'm sorry. I'm wandering around too much. So anyway, in my...
It's a random walk.
I'm sorry about this. There are physicists who try to understand life on the basis of energy and things like that, concepts that come from physics. And I think that just doesn't work. I think you need to look at a higher level of abstraction. And I think the first paper that I find on this topic of the mathematics of biology is a piece of work by von Neumann, which is not his self-reproducing computer in a cellular automata world that's very well known. It's an earlier paper from, I don't remember, in the 40s, I think, a talk that he wrote up as a paper. And it's very courageously says that there are natural automata and artificial automata. Artificial automata are computers, which were just being invented, and natural automata are biological organisms. It seems to me that what this paper is saying, that the fundamental concept of biology is software. Mm-hmm. And it's also the fundamental concept of computer technology. This idea of software is what explains the success of the computers as a technology, but it's also what explains the plasticity of the biosphere, because it's also based on software. So the idea would be my interpretation of von Neumann's paper from the 40s, is that nature discovered software before we did. Just until Watson and Crick. This was before Watson and Crick, by the way, a little bit before. And it inspired Sidney Brenner, a lot of the people who created molecular biology, which says that information is the most important thing to understand in biology, who were physicists, who were inspired by a little book by Schrödinger called What is Life? Now, Sidney Brenner, whom I had the privilege of chatting with on a few occasions, shared an office with Crick at Cambridge. He's one of the creators of molecular biology. And he was inspired by von Neumann's paper. He was in South Africa, and his friend was Seymour Papert, who was interested in computers. And Papert told Brenner, who was a chemist, about this paper of von Neumann's. And as a result of that, Brenner decided to go to Cambridge eventually, and he ended up sharing an office with Crick. And Brenner is the gentleman who said, to hell with metabolism, to hell with energy. We're going to create a new field by concentrating on information in the cell and in biology. You have to forget about it. So this is the fundamental idea, I think. And it's an idea that doesn't exist in physics, the idea of software. This is a new concept. And what I've tried to do in metabiology is go one step. Okay. Now, then von Neumann comes up with this cellular automata model, a cellular automata world, and he constructs an organism that can replicate itself, right? But it can't move, by the way. In this world, you can't translate yourself. The only way to move is to make a copy of yourself and then make another copy.
Interesting. Okay.
Copy. Yeah. So I think now von Neumann was doing this to keep sane. He was working for the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. He had been involved at Los Alamos. Everybody was horrified by the atom bomb. There's a whole movie about this now on Oppenheimer, right? And so von Neumann was a member of the Atomic Energy Commission and was involved in decisions, I think, of horrible things like targeting. I don't know. So to keep himself sane, he did a big crossword puzzle. He's very bright, and he outlined this cellular automata world and a self-reproducing automata. But I'm going to criticize one of my heroes. This was just a crossword puzzle he was doing because the real work he was doing at that time was not mathematically significant and not up to von Neumann as a thinker. But it's the wrong level to think about biology mathematically, because if you have to create a whole world that functions and you have an organism that is worked out in all detail in this cellular automata world, that's too big a job. It may be fun to do a simulation, of evolution in some toy world on a computer. But if you want to prove a theorem, that's too level. I'm interested in proving theorems. Now, you can do a lot of good work simulating evolution or organisms on a computer. That's valuable work. But I'm more interested in proving theorems. That's the kind of way I work. So that's too low level a formulation of biology, and you're never going to be able to come up with a whole physical world in which you can have an organism that you can prove is going to evolve. That's too big a problem. And it's like creating the whole world. So one has to think about this problem at the right level to be able to prove any theorems. So the way I thought might be a simplified model of biology that would be mathematically amenable goes like this. If you say that DNA is the software of life and that the basic idea, mathematical idea of biology is software, as von Neumann says, I believe, and I agree with that. It's a popular thing to say DNA is the software of life, right? Ventnor says that, for example, in his book. Okay, so if you take that idea seriously, it's going to be very tough to have a mathematical theory of evolution where you're dealing with DNA. DNA is very complicated language. To run a DNA program, you need a cell. It's going to be, you can have systems biology, right? Doing good simulations, but you're not going to be able to prove any theorems because the system is too complicated and messy. So I said, instead of looking at natural software, which is DNA, and trying to look how it evolves and see if you can prove theorems, I said, let's look at artificial software. Von Neumann talks about natural automata and artificial automata. Let's look at artificial software.
Artificial software being any kind of software?
Would be a computer program. And let's make random mutations in a computer program and see if we can prove theorems about the way it evolves. So that's the idea of metabiology. It's one step removed from normal biology in an attempt to get something simple enough that you can actually prove theorems. So instead of subjecting natural software, which is DNA, to random mutations and trying to prove that evolution will occur under certain circumstances, my suggestion was to look at something one removed, which is to take artificial software, which is some computer programming language, subject it to mutations and see if you can random mutations and see if you have to put in selection somehow and see if you can prove theorems about evolution taking place. And this is tractable mathematically. I have a sketch of a very simplified version of this where I can actually prove some theorems. So this is my suggestion for how to do a mathematical biology that gets at the fundamental question of the ideal would be to prove that Darwinian evolution can explain the diversity of the biosphere we see here. That would be wonderful, but I don't think it can be done. I don't think it's possible. I don't think mathematics can deal with a messy, complicated million-pound marshmallow like that. But if you reformulate the problem one step removed from biology and you're making changes, random changes in some computer programming language that you pick, and then you subject it somehow to selective pressure in a toy model where I don't have a whole physical universe. I don't have a cellular automata world. I'm formulating the problem more abstractly. Then I can actually prove theorems. You get a little theory that I call metabiology, and I published a little book about this called Proving Darwin, which is not really what the book does. The subtitle is Making Biology Mathematical. Well, it's an attempt. It's an embryonic theory that I hope points in that direction. The title it's not an academic book. It's actually a maybe mathematically sophisticated popular science book. But the title had to be catchy in the hope of maybe selling copies. If it had been published as an academic book, it would have had a more tentative and more modest title.
So metabiology is going along the lines of thinking, okay, it's messy to think about embodiment. Let's uncouple that. It's messy to think about metabolism. It's messy to think about the environment. So there's this continual uncoupling in order to work with what's most general. However, evolution requires a fitness function. Yet survival of the fittest implies you're fit for something or fit relative to something.
Right. Yeah, and metabiology has a fitness function. Well, first of all, I also do another piece of simplification is I don't deal with populations. I only have one organism at a time. And you subject it to a modification, and if it gets fitter, it replaces the original organism. It's simple. There's no population. There's just one organism. So it ends up being a random walk in software space. Well, it's a hill climbing random walk in software space because you have this one organism that's being mutated. And if the mutation made it fitter, then that becomes the organism. So that's a step in the software space. So this is sort of a random walk in software space, which is a nice new phrase. I don't think that anybody ever thought.
Okay, so software space, the space of all software, the space of all possible programs?
Of all possible organisms, because the organisms are just software. Oh, they're only DNA, in essence. There are no bodies, there are no populations. I'm trying to make this simple enough that I can actually prove theorems. And there is an environment, sort of. This model actually needs an oracle for the halting problem. This is the environment. This is where new information comes from.
Uh-huh.
That corresponds to the environment, actually, in this toy model. And you can prove some theorems about the rate of evolution depending on how you evolve. So I look at three regimes in this toy world. Well, one of them is, what is creationism called?
Intelligent design?
Intelligent design is if you always pick the best mutation, God knows how, that will have the organism improve in fitness as quickly as possible. And that's not the real world, obviously. Okay, but that evolves very rapidly. So that shows you the most rapid evolution that's possible in this model. Then the worst case, the slowest way of evolving is if you have no memory and you basically have to search through the entire space of all possible organisms. Well, in one case, you get n bits of information in time n. That's intelligent design because each Mutation is just the one you need to get one more bit of information from the environment. Now, if you're doing a random walk, you're doing exhaustive search in the space of all possible organisms. It's going to take you a time that grows exponentially to get n bits of information in your organism. It's going to be 2 to the n, on the order of 2 to the n. So in one case, it goes up linearly to get n bits of information in your organism. That's if somehow you picked out the best possible mutation. But if you pick mutations at random and you don't remember the previous organism, you just pick another organism. So that's exhaustive search, and that's the worst case. And it'll take you sort of on the order of 2 to the n steps to get n bits of information in your organism. Now, how about real Darwinian evolution, where you're making a random change in an organism, and then you stay with the new organism, then you make a random change in that. So that has memory. And how does that compare with the best case and the worst case? It gives you an idea. And the answer, surprisingly enough, is that to get n bits of information from an oracle for the halting problem, it takes time that grows as
N squared?
n to the third. Yeah, nearly n squared. Yeah, nearly n squared. Yeah, good guess.
Yeah.
I think it's n plus epsilon, actually.
Uh-huh.
I think n to the third works, but actually it can be pretty close to n squared, which is pretty fast. It's not as fast as, now this is not a practical model because I am using a oracle for the halting problem. This is where the new information comes from. This is the environment.
Can you briefly explain what an oracle is?
Oh, an oracle. This is a less known masterpiece paper by Turing.